seminar in our MSc Education, Digital and Social Change series on frontiers in educational technology. And this has primarily been student-led. So my thanks to Carmen, Zushini, and Owen for leading on this, made my job really quite easy. So thanks to you. And this is the first in a series of 6. And people will have the web link as well for the others, which you can have a look at later after this one. So I'll hand it over to Zushini now to introduce Professor Gerry Lacey, who I'd like to personally thank for agreeing to give the kickoff lecture. I'm very happy he agreed to do so. So thanks everyone. Zushini, over to you.
Great, thank you Niall. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you Professor Gerry Lacey for giving us this talk. I would just quickly introduce Professor as well as kind of the theme of this talk before handing it to Professor Lacey for this really amazing session. So Gerry Lacey is affiliated with the Robotics and Engineering Department at Maynooth University. He has held leadership positions in both industry and academia and delivered significant changes and growth in both environments. Professor Lacey also founded and grown 2 technology startups that have transferred deep IP from the lab to the market. His research is focused on human-machine collaboration using augmented reality, machine learning, and robotics. So the title of this session is From Surgery to Hand Hygiene, the Theory and Practice of Teaching Physical Skills. It discusses the teaching of physical skills for minimally invasive surgery and clinical hand hygiene. It would also explore the pedagogical models and the practical design choices. This session also touches on the challenges and insights that result from launching EdTech products into the healthcare market, which is something that we've also kind of discussed in this term and last term within the course. So I'm sure people have questions after your slides, Professor. All to you.
Great, thank you. So let me just share my slides and we can get started. So can everybody see those? Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So I guess the first question would be what is a professor of robotics doing in education? And I guess a little bit of a backstory is required. So I did my PhD in robotics. So it was
oh, sorry, Gerry, if I could just pop in there. I think some people may have their microphones on. Just if people could mute their mics. That would be great. I think everyone should have them muted by now. Sorry, Gerry.
Okay, right.
Thank you.
So we've got on the left-hand side there, you can see what is in fact a smart walking frame. So it's a robotic walking frame, and we very quickly began when we were doing our user trials and fielding the system. What we discovered is that success and failure was down to learning. Basically, we decided that if somebody hadn't picked up how to use this device within the first 15 minutes, they were never going to use it. And so they had to sort of achieve learning success and a learning outcome very, very quickly. But it wasn't knowledge. It was physical learning. They had to learn the responses through their arms. So it had a touch interface that was touch sensitive. So you can see that the little old lady there, she has the handlebars in her hands. And so as they leaned from one side to another, that lean was being picked up by the robot and converted into their intention as to the direction. There was also voice feedback that they were responding to as well. So ultimately, we learned that, learning is key. We also learned a little bit about how to design learning for older people. They're not as different as everybody else, as you might expect. But they do have some sensitivities about short-term memory. You don't want to have, very deep hierarchies of control. It needs to be kept relatively light from a short-term memory requirement perspective. Also, if it doesn't work very quickly, older people are just not interested because they're not going to invest a large amount of time into learning something new. because I guess they don't have a long time in order to get the benefit. So if they don't get the benefit quickly, they move on. Anyway, for reasons that I won't bore you with, we spun this out as a company, and then we actually did the classic startup thing as a pivot. So ultimately, as I sometimes describe it, we kind of wrapped the robot inside out, and we developed a surgical simulator. This was a mixed reality surgical simulator. So what you see here is a surgeon operating with laparoscopic instruments. These are long, kind of what you might call like chopsticks. They're very long and thin, and they essentially have a little pliers at the bottom of them. And what you're seeing on the screen there is a view from inside a box, and then overlaid on that is augmented reality. So that's the first of the case studies that we'll talk about. And it was really, here we're really now into very explicit physical learning, and the objective of the system was learning. Okay, so the overview of the talk is really, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the theories that were relevant to the learning. I mean, that they're obviously relevant to general learning, but physical learning is a little bit different, as I'll go into. I'm going to talk about two case studies. The first one is the PROMIS mixed reality minimally invasive surgical training system. And the second case study is SureWash, which is a mixed reality hand hygiene training system. So both of these systems rely on computer vision to track the objects that are in the scene, and then we overlay learning material on top of that. So let's go into the theory for a minute. So when we started to look at the theory behind both of these situations, what we discovered that there's a number of different theories, and they all kind of overlap. And in some senses, they're different lenses on pretty much the same thing. So here we're dealing very much with procedural learning. We're looking at learning a physical task. So yes, there is a certain amount of concept and knowledge associated with this, but fundamentally the part of the brain that we're training is different. It's the sensory motor cortex. It learns very slowly. But once it learns, it tends to retain that learning for quite a long time. And from the neuroscience perspective, what has been shown is that, you know, simple physical tasks take about 2 weeks of repeated practice to learn. Learning in short bursts, and sleeping between those bursts is important. So, for example, sitting somebody down and giving them 4 hours of training is not going to be particularly effective. If you take that 4 hours and you split it into 5-minute slots, and then you do those 5 minutes every day, you will get a much better return. So distributed practice is more effective than a mass practice. And then also the way that you train is also important. So the concepts that are, and you'll see kind of these kind of overlap, but from Bloom, the concept of mastery learning, that you break the learning into individual chunks and that you don't move to a subsequent chunk until you have mastered the initial one. And this is particularly important when it comes to physical skills, because if you don't master each of the steps of the physical skills, then the subsequent step becomes very, very difficult and very frustrating. And unfortunately, I don't have the diagram, but in gaming, there's a concept of flow. So you want to keep people engaged. So you want the task that they're doing to be sufficiently challenging that they have to engage with it, but not so challenging that they become disheartened and give up, nor too simple that they become bored and give up. So the idea is that in progressively building your challenges, you keep them incrementally getting more difficult and more challenging, but they have to pass it. So this maps very well onto games. You know, take it, you know, something like Angry Birds, where you start off with really basic, simple things, and then the challenges get harder and harder and harder. What's also interesting is they get harder you develop that skill, and then the next 2 or 3 levels become quite easy. They're not maybe quite as challenging, and that's related to the last concept, which is overlearning. So first we've got mastery learning from Bloom. Then we come to K. Anders Ericsson, who developed this concept called deliberate practice. He's oft misquoted as the 10,000 hour rule guy, which of course he gets really frustrated and angry about, because that's not actually what he said, but that's what Malcolm Gladwell interpreted from what he had said. Basically what his technique is, and it's used quite a lot in medical training, sports training, and in musical training. And it's very much about the coach, in this case, focuses the student on practicing each round with a measurable improvement. So focusing on one aspect of performance and improving that aspect. So in terms of outcome measures, say something like golf, it's the distance to the hole. It's pretty clear. But in musicianship, it might be a slightly more complex, and it maybe requires the interpretation of an expert or a coach to provide the feedback and to be able to deconstruct what part of the practice is contributing to that error function. So deliberate practice is a model that has been very well validated, and in the case of physical learning is really appropriate because it involves a lot of repetition. So the concept of rote learning has definitely fallen out of favor, but in physical learning, the rote learning aspect, or the repeated practice, is absolutely to the fore, because it is how that part of the brain learns. It learns through repeated short burst training. We also know that test enhanced learning, so that by repeatedly testing, you will enhance performance, because again, you're generating an objective error function and you're constantly trying to minimize that error function. The concept of overlearning is really related to the retention of those skills once learned. So if you achieve mastery or you pass the test, what the concept of overlearning is that however long it took you to develop that mastery, let's say it was 100 attempts, that you should continue to practice for about 50 more attempts in order to embed that skill. And again, you begin to see this concept in things like Angry Birds, where you try and you try and you try, you develop the skill to get you through a particular level, and the next 2 or 3 levels basically repeat that same skill, but you're getting more success out of those. So it's driving both. So it's kind of hard, easy, easy, hard is the kind of sequence. So those are the kind of theories, and there's a paper that we wrote this year, or published this year, that kind of summarizes these and other related concepts that are related to physical learning, and then how they influence the design of a learning system. But ultimately what it is that you break down the learning objectives into small incremental tasks. They get incrementally more difficult. Each task has a piece of assessment at the end, which is both the formative assessment, in that people will potentially fail it and then learn to get better, and is also the summative assessment that allows them to pass and move to the next level. So we'll begin with the case studies. So Promise was effectively what might be called a box trainer or a part task trainer, and inside this box was a stereo vision system that was tracking everything in 3 dimensions. There was also a camera in here that was showing the inside of the box, which you can see on the right. So inside the box, there are plastic models, and then overlaid on top of that is virtual content, which is providing instruction or feedback or engagement. And so you can see here, the part that I've marked out now, that is graphical and is overlaid on top of the video image. So what is actually in the box is an anatomical model, which is anatomically correct, a piece of the colon. And that yellow stuff, you're going, oh, that doesn't look real. It is. That's actually what your fat, intestinal fat looks like. It's bright yellow, and it's coating your organs. And this is potentially the bad stuff that we want to minimize. But it's necessary to hold all your bits together. Anyway. So the curriculum here is we built these into a set of progressive tasks. We started off by laparoscopic target tracking. So that is, you're driving a mobile camera around and following a target around. And so you have to learn the hand-eye coordination of which is reversed because you're basically operating via TV. And so you begin to learn that hand-eye coordination. Then the next one is bead in pot. You pick up a little bead and you drop it into a pot. The next task would be bead transfer. So you transfer from one pliers to the other pliers without dropping it. And then threading a hole, dissection, which is cutting things open, and then knot tying, which is really complex because it's, you have to be able to do it both-handed. So you could do it with your left hand and then with your right hand. And it's typically done what might be described as one-handed. So one hand holds the thread and the other one ties the knot. And then ultimately suturing, which is the operating at the top of your license, as it were, as a minimally invasive surgeon. We also then, as well as these part task trainers, we then did full procedures. So we were then now contextualizing these in terms of the medical knowledge. So a laparoscopic cholecystectomy is the removal of the gallbladder. So we would have a gallbladder model, and then the person had to remove the gallbladder. And then a laparoscopic colectomy, which is removing a piece of the colon and then joining the two pieces of the colon back together with an anastomosis, or a surgical stitch that goes right around it. And then you test to make sure that there's no leaky bits. So that's what it looked like. So critical to the success of this was the motivation for developing these trainers is that surgeons were being approved on the time served basis. So how many procedures had you observed, participated in, and completed, versus being actually proficient. Like my mother has, tried to get a driving license and has driven lots, but she has always failed her test, right? So she is not a proficient driver and should not be behind the wheel of a car. And the same is true of surgeons. Some surgeons will say, some people should just be dermatologists, right? And never go near a patient with a knife in their hand. And we needed to be able to measure this. And we talked to a lot of surgeons about, how do you know a good surgeon? And they talked about somebody having finesse or grace. And you could just tell by looking at them. But that's, fine at one level, but we had to be able to turn that into a number. So what we did by looking at surgical videos of novices versus experts was, novices essentially break down the path in their heads as they're trying to do a task. So let's say I'm trying to get to that blue dot with a surgical instrument. So I'll take my surgical instrument and I'll get close to the blue dot, and then I think about the next step, which is to reorient myself so that I can suture or cut or whatever. So you can imagine that my short-term memory is able to deal with the next step, and then I'll worry about the following step when I get there. And so novices tend to have these little loops in their three-dimensional path as they're moving the instruments. Experts don't. They tend to have these smooth arcs where they're not just planning to the next step, they're planning 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. And that is the mark of the expert surgeon. And we were able to come up with this really robust metric for surgical skill, based effectively almost on a way of measuring the short-term memory planning ability. And what this was really measuring is the cognitive bandwidth of the student. So you could tell whether the student had to think about the next step or they had automated the next step. And in physical learning, this is ultimately what you're trying to do. You're trying to develop the muscle memory so that people do things automatically. And what that does is it leaves the cognitive bandwidth available to see a bleed, which is happening in the top corner of the video. And they will be able to see it because they have the cognitive bandwidth to be able to do so. When you have somebody who is concentrating really hard, they will miss a lot of things that are going wrong in their video. And that was where you get surgical mistakes happening. And so this was a really robust measure of physical skill. And we obviously published this in IEEE Multimedia, but also we had numerous different surgical teams validate this metric as a valid measure of learning. So just to wrap up this case study and to touch on the commercial aspects. So we basically came up with this in 2003. We launched it in the market in 2004. We got loads of awards for innovation and so forth, because it was the first augmented reality surgical trainer out there. Still one of the few. And it was sold to leading medical hospitals all around the world. So Emory, Harvard, Stanford, RCSI, Imperial, you name it, they all were buying it. And partly because we were overcoming a problem, which was that most of the virtual reality trainers had no haptic feel or very little haptic feel. And we were giving very realistic feelings back, and we were able to do perfectly valid thread, because, you know, once the surgical task was over, you remove the model and then you start to try and break the knots. And that's a classic way of testing whether the knots are well formed. So we were able to do things that a virtual reality trainer wasn't able to do, but yet we had the benefit of a virtual reality trainer in that we were able to measure skill. So lots of validation studies were done. So it demonstrated construct validity of the work. And it eventually became a credentialing test in a large number of hospitals in the US, where, you know, as the student would come to the end of their training, they went on to promise. And if they didn't pass on promise, they weren't given their license and they had to go back and practice again. We also learned that some people learn slowly and they get to the right destination. Some people learn quickly and get to the right destination. So having a self-directed learning was really important, because it allowed different skill set, people with different underlying capabilities, to still learn and to learn successfully. We also learned that there are some people out there who just learn incredibly quickly when it comes to physical learning. They're the ballet dancers and the athletes, and, you know, they're fantastic, and they just learn this stuff really, really fast. But that doesn't mean that the people who are learning more slowly are not just as good as surgeons, or potentially even better. In the end, Haptica was sold to CEA Healthcare, a medical simulation company, in 2011. So that was promise. And going on to the next case study was SureWash. So you think, well, why would you bother training people in hand hygiene, particularly in hospitals? Like, because everybody knows how to wash their hands. We learn it as a kid. Turns out that there's a big difference between what we might call social hand hygiene and clinical hand hygiene. So basically, if you go into hospital, it's one of the most dangerous places on the planet, right? Basically, 1 in 20 patients is going to get a hospital-acquired infection. And so basically in the States, you've got 2 million people a year are dying of a hospital-acquired infection. You know, that's what's killing them. So they're going in, you know, with a sore toe, and they're getting C. difficile or MRSA or VRE or other infections that are floating around in the hospitals. These infections are resistant to antibiotics, and that's what the problem is, because the bugs are evolving to be resistant. And because that's the hospital environment is kind of, it's the petri dish for superbugs. And then people are going in there and they're all immunocompromised. So you're taking people who are most at risk and bringing them to the most dangerous environment in the world. So you're getting a lot of people dying from infection. So that's, in the States, that's about 100,000 people a year. And 80% of infections are transferred by touch. So obviously we've gone through COVID, it's airborne, that's a serious issue. But what's happening in the background is that the touch generated infections are spreading quite strongly in hospitals at the moment. It says that 40% of healthcare personnel are adhering to hand hygiene. That is incredibly optimistic. There are studies that are showing that it's really around about 20%, whether they're fully complying with hand hygiene. So what you see on the right-hand side of your screen is one of the SureWash systems. So basically, the person goes up and they do the WHO protocol, which is a series of 6 steps, which have been clinically validated to show that remove, you know, the vast majority of the bugs from your hands. And it's a very rigid process, because you need to make sure that every single surface is clear. And so the person didn't get through, and they were shown which of the steps that they missed. And so they have an opportunity now to go back in and to complete it. So as they're doing it, there's progress bars on the screen there, which is telling them that they're doing it correctly. So you're getting positive feedback that you're doing it correctly. And if you're not doing it correctly, the image turns into a video to demonstrate what you should be doing, and you can see your own hands. And so you're getting kind of coaching feedback as well. We split this training into a series of stages. It starts off with that very tutorial mode, and then it gets faster and faster. And the amount of scaffolding that you're giving to the student is reducing all the time. So we're both increasing the difficulty of passing each level by making it faster and smoother, and we're reducing the amount of scaffolding and support that they're getting until the very end, at which point you've got no scaffolding whatsoever, and you need to be able to repeat the WHO sequence of 6 steps from memory in under 20 seconds. So that's what you might call a blind evaluation test, or a delayed recall test. So basically, demonstrate to me that you can do hand hygiene. So here again, computer vision is being used to give an objective measure of hand hygiene technique. And the advantage for hospitals is they have to constantly train people to do this, because what happens is that they're trying to counteract our childhood learning. They want people to go through the 6 steps, but well, we did a number of studies and we found that what we called it was splash and dash, in that people would go in, they'd wet their hands for about 5 seconds, and then they go, right, we're out of here. We did find that there was a very high correlation between splash and dash and Rolexes. So I don't know what that means, other than potentially doctors are our biggest offenders, and surgeons. But nurses were tended to be quite diligent. What it meant was that we could train people 24/7 on the hospital wards. We were able to position the training in the ward. So rather than taking the nurses and bringing them to a training room, giving them, a lecture, giving them a demonstration, and then sending them back to the wards, you could have lost 3 hours in that, even if for a 1-hour training, because, they go have a cup of tea on the way. Here you're doing workplace learning and short bursts. So it aligns to the neuroscience and it aligns to the learning theory. And you can then say, position it at the door of the ward for 2 weeks, and then it moves on to the next ward. And so the system moves around the hospital, delivering training. It means you've less time spent in training, less disruption to the provision of patient care, and you generate records of competence. And we also do a knowledge of infection prevention and control quiz. So things like, if you've got a C. difficile outbreak, then you can't use alcohol gel to kill it, or norovirus, it won't get killed by alcohol, but soap and water will kill it. So you need to know which type of hand hygiene to do in what situation. It also, what we learned very quickly is that that's accessible to both staff and patients and visitors, and it was the latter 2 category that was very important. We also learned that gamification of learning was a real drive to engagement. We used to put up this thing where we would tell you exactly how many seconds it took you to do a particular pose or sequence. And we found that the nurses used to start competing with each other. And then we got the ward manager came to us and said, take off that timer, because I'm finding my nurses are just playing your machine. Go, but they're learning hand hygiene. I don't care. So gamification is a double-edged sword. So just very quickly, we had a portable version which was used in smaller centres, but it was able to be used in low resource countries. So we partner with the ICANN network, Infection Control Network Africa, who deliver training to hospitals around Africa, and they use a machine like this. We also had a bit of fun with this, and we turned it into a full-on game. So we took the gamification thing and just went, all right, how far do we push this? So we turned this into a 2-player 1980s game, arcade game, which we used to use at trade shows and stuff, and it was a blast. And we got it so you could see yourself and you were doing it. We also had a robot racing version. So by doing correct hand hygiene, your robot could run. It was a lot of fun. And we also developed an app version where you basically take the phone and you lie it on the table and you do your hand hygiene above the phone and you get the feedback here. And again, you can see how the system works. You see your hands, you get the video, and then progress bars are going up the side. And we also partnered with a Germs Journey from De Montfort University, who had basically developed a hand hygiene protocol for kids. And we developed an app version of that for children. So getting to the kind of the education theory piece, so we took the system and we brought it to the WHO Collaborating Center in the Hospital University of Geneva. And we did basically a comparison of how the learning was effective, compared it to human evaluation. We also have used it in how it measured in practice and what was the impact on award. I also did a study where I did a slightly different configuration of the system. It was kind of an IoT device. It was positioned above a sink in a hospital, and it was left there for 3-4 months. This was very interesting from an education perspective because there was clearly a big jump in performance when we installed the system. But when we turned the system off 3 months later, performance went straight back to baseline. And I had coffee with my neuroscience colleagues, and I said to them, got really puzzling results. They've been practicing for 3 months and they're not doing it. And he says, well, what you have there is cognitive offload. The technology has taken away the need to learn, and therefore your scaffolding is still in place. And until you remove the scaffolding, you're taking away, you're removing the need to learn. And it's a bit like how we use our mobile phones. We don't have to remember phone numbers anymore. They're in our phone. Whereas back in the day, before you had a mobile phone, you had to remember all of these numbers in your head. And so this was a kind of real interesting thing, is that if we were to put in technology, we had to make sure that it was operating in such a way that it was constantly testing people as well as scaffolding their behavior. So scaffolding those who needed the scaffolding, but its first mode of operation should be testing. And it's sort of test-driven learning would be the appropriate way. But really, that's because if we don't do that, people will not learn because we've scaffolded them too much. Other interesting things from building these systems and putting them into practice was that the incentives around learning were incredibly important to whether people would learn. So we'd obviously learned not to over scaffold, but then what we also discovered was the incentives for learning were very important. So here, what we did was we made things voluntary, we made them compulsory, we gave people incentives like, you were able to get into a lottery for a closer car parking space if you finished your hand hygiene. And then there was the big stick, which was you were not allowed to apply for promotion until you had completed your annual hand hygiene training. So each of those different incentives really drove participation and engagement. So at one point, one of the lead nurses said to me, well, I started off this thing and I was all kind of lovey-dovey and, oh, well, give them the tools and then they'll just do it because they know it's the right thing for the patients. And she said, and, I'm probably a little bit right of Genghis Khan at this point, because now I believe in the big stick because that's where I really get my results. So incentives are really critical when it comes to putting these things into the field. So overall, what are the lessons learned? And the role of technology is very much to provide that objective measurement and to make objective measurement obviously personality neutral. And that was critical in the surgical case because the students felt that it was whether the surgeon liked them or not was influencing whether they were getting good marks or bad marks. And it was less objective. And at least with the machine, they felt that, number one, it was objective. Number two, they could practice on their own and they didn't pick up bad habits because they were getting coached as they were learning. So the technology in both the surgical case and in the hand hygiene case provides objective measurement of skill that the students can trust. And that's key to having, self-directed learning. Also important in the AI was to provide that coaching feedback, to provide the feedback that is where you deconstruct the practice and actually identify what people are doing wrong and giving them the appropriate feedback. And then to match the challenges to their individual skill levels. So rather than you have to teach to the class or to the middle of the class, you teach to the individual and where they are so that they can maintain that flow state and the engagement. The other thing that, you know, probably isn't as big for most applications, but in the corporate setting is absolutely essential, that all records of learning are critical in professional environments, particularly, you know, where it's a health and safety skill or a credentialing skill. Those records are absolutely essential, both for students to track their own learning, but also for in an employment context, to make sure that they're doing it and to make sure that they're certified to do a particular task. So in sort of summary, you know, technology plays a really important role here in that it increases the access. So we saw that we were able to give high quality training in low resource countries by using smartphones to deliver the training. It improved the quality of the training because frankly, most of the hand hygiene training was truly dreadful when we started. And also it was much cheaper. We reckon that using the technology, although it's a capital upfront payment, the system was paying itself back within 3 months because of the loss of work time due to training, and the system was providing equivalent and better training in a much shorter time. But the key lesson here is that the context and implementation are absolutely critical, particularly in, say, the nursing environment. What was absolutely critical was that the team cohort had to be motivated to learn hand hygiene better. They had to be given feedback on a regular basis. And how the system was introduced to each team was absolutely critical to success and failure. So, you know, had to be in whether they trusted the person who was introducing the system to them was actually a big factor in its successful adoption. So while, you know, as the developers of the technology, we sort of feel that, oh, it's you know, neutral in the sense of, oh, it doesn't matter who puts it in. It actually did. You know, personal relationships, particularly in a healthcare context, were really, really important. That if this was introduced by a senior person who had a lot of credibility, the uptake was good. And if it was introduced much more in a kind of a top-down manner with a lot less engagement in the introduction, or kind of, you know, you have to use this machine, then you got much lower engagement and much worse results. So I'll leave it there. I think that's about the amount of time. So we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gerry. So it's time for the audience to raise questions. I'm going to ask everyone to just use the hand raise button, and as a moderator, I would just kind of go through each question. I can also start off by the questions. Thank you so much for sharing that, Gerry. That's really fascinating. In this course, we talk quite a bit about like when we're designing an EdTech product for a specific context. Sometimes, you know, you have these understanding of theory, but unexpected things come up in practice as you're designing it. So I'm wondering, like in the process of designing Promise and SureWash, was there like moments like that where it was unexpected and you and the team kind of have to figure out something on the spot?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different stories. So the first time we showed the prototype to one of the lead surgeons in the Royal College of Surgery, it was essentially we had a bowl inside the device, and inside the bowl were a bunch of marbles. So the surgeon was to basically insert the tool into the bowl and then move the marbles around. And there's a very funny thing with sensory congruence. When you're getting feedback from your audio and your visual, you will effectively hallucinate the appropriate response in your other sense. And what happened was he could swear that he was feeling the marbles. And then when we opened up the box to prove to him that there were no marbles in there, he got really angry with us. And what that showed us was that it was really important that people knew what was virtual and what was real, what was physical and what wasn't. So in the example that I showed, where you had that sort of instruction content in the image, where I kind of marked it out as this is the virtual bit, it was quite cartoon. And it was absolutely deliberate, because we found that if it wasn't cartoon, people got upset as to whether it was virtual or not. I mean, they knew they were in a learning environment and they knew they had to respond to the events, but it was important for them to know what was learning content and what was real. And so that was one of the things that was unexpected for us. We thought, oh, we have to make the graphics as realistic as possible. But to be effective as a learning tool, we found that it needed to be cartoon. In the hand hygiene case, one of the surprising things is the fact that we were generating engagement, which was what we would hope to do with the kind of gamification of the learning. But in a professional context, you know, the nursing manager was all about the efficiency of delivery of care. And although you were putting training into the workplace and that was all good and matched up with the theory, the manager still had their objective, which was delivery of care, and they didn't really care about the training going on because that was being mandated by somebody else. And so the conflict of cultures between different parts of the hospital is one of the things that really surprised us. And we had to we were negotiating between different camps within the hospital in the delivery of learning in the workplace.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Niall?
Thanks, Gerry. Really interesting. I have a number of questions, but maybe I'll stick to two. One was going back to the very start of the talk, and in the course we talk a lot about sort of participatory design, engagement with users, etc. And I noticed you'd mentioned design, so maybe you could just talk us a little bit more through the role of participants in any of your number of your products in the design process.
Yeah, I decided not to focus on that part of the process here in this talk, but effectively each of the systems is co-designed. So effectively what our process will look like, we start off with kind of interviews. So we will basically go talk to folks, find out what they really want, you know, and it was in one of those sort of, in both the nursing home, the robot for the nursing home in Promise and in SureWash, that was the process. We went in, we talked to them, what are your pain points? What are you trying to do? You know, and that's where we heard about, well, we have this box trainer thing, but we have the students learning bad habits, and then they come to the expert surgeon, and then they're trying to correct their bad habits, and it was inefficient, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. And then we develop a series of prototypes, and it's quite a tight loop. You know, we start off with kind of effectively a cardboard or a Wizard of Oz prototype, and then we test that with a small group of users, and then again and again. So it's very iterative design or co-design with users, and getting feedback at each step of the way. So you know, our first prototype was a cardboard of the surgical trainer, was a cardboard box and a stick, right? And that was what we gave to the head of postgraduate training in RCSI. And we learned something from that very first one. We were testing our technology, but you know, we were learning very quickly that there is the sort of learning theory, there is the engineering of the technology, and then there is the user experience. But the user experience is the critical glue that keeps everything together. So, you know, ultimately in co-design, you're really optimizing that user experience, and then making sure that your users stay engaged, that they're getting something out of it, and then that the people who are commissioning the system are also getting what they want out of it. And you're managing these different user groups in order to kind of come up with your overall design. So a very interactive process. And we tended to use a technique which sometimes gets called the voice of the customer, where you would typically have an engineer and then somebody who has, we used to describe it as a better user interface, maybe more in sales or in marketing or in user design. Psychologists actually were the ones that we used to use most often. So you'd have an engineer and a psychologist because they listen differently, and they're listening for different things and different opportunities. The engineer was very important because they knew what the technology was capable of, what was easy and what was hard. And the psychologist was listening very much for the user experience and the lived experience and what are the other issues outside of the technology that were going to be important. So that was our process.
Really good. And can I ask one more, if that's okay?
Yep.
I've got a number, but I've been a bit cheeky. Sorry, but just to follow up, was the hand washing one, and just reflection on the approach to training, as in training the AI, and the real world experience, where I think I understood, and correct me if I'm wrong, you had the camera in the real world setting where you saw, you know, they're going back to baseline. And I guess the washing the hands, you have a range of skin tones. One might forget to take off a ring. I don't know, there's water splashing, soap, I don't know, whatever. And so was it trained in the same way, or can you just reflect a little bit from a technical point of view?
Apologies, that whining you're hearing is my coworker. She needs to get out. 1 second. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
No problems, you know.
Just a reflection on the relationship
between
between training data and real world.
So yeah, I mean, you're aware of computer vision and the complexity. So yeah, we spent quite a lot of time working with different skin tones, and different issues. So what we weren't doing is we weren't doing rings, because you're allowed to wear a plain wedding band, but you're not allowed to have false nails or stones on the ring, or to have any jewelry on your wrist, watches, for example, or band in most hospitals. And you have to be bare to the elbow. So we were doing some skin analysis, but while people are different skin tones, we're all roughly the same color, but the intensity of reflection of light is slightly different. So in the color space, we're actually quite tightly clustered together. And we were also using depth images to segment it. So it did the secret sauce is very much in the way that we process both shape and gesture. And looking at like if you look at a video sequence, and this is true of most skills, is that certain frames of the video carry more information about the thing you're trying to measure than others. Certain poses would be transition. You're transitioning from one pose to another, so there's actually no information within those. Other poses are incredibly informative as to whether somebody's doing it correctly or not. So what we were effectively doing was recognizing what we would call the high utility images, where they contain a lot of information about the thing we're trying to measure. So we'd recognize the type of image and then use that to process the thing. So we're effectively looking for only some of the images in the video and recognizing certain shapes. So yeah, it was quite a lot of images being captured at the time to build up that data set. And you know, recently, because of COVID, we've had a lot of approaches from people who have, you know, taken a dirty big data set, chucked it into a machine learning model, and then found that, hey, it doesn't really work quite as well. And it's just sometimes the big data approach doesn't have that subtlety of being able to say, yes, this is an important image, this is not an important image, and I should ignore that one. So those are some of the learnings on the deep learning side.
Very helpful, thank you.
Carmen?
Oh, hi. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges that you faced in delivering these projects in low resource settings.
So in terms of the low resource settings, I guess one of the things is that just because it's a low resource setting doesn't mean that the people who are delivering the care want to deliver low quality care, you know, just because it's cheaper. I mean, they still want to deliver the best quality care. The interesting thing about the low resource settings is that in the Western medicine or in sort of developed world, in hospitals, there are lots of screens everywhere. When we went into the low resource settings, there were no screens anywhere. There was no TVs. So you couldn't just stick on a video or do a PowerPoint presentation. So having a self-contained unit that was providing the training was actually very useful. And the pandemic actually taught us all about the ubiquity of mobile phones. So we had developed the app. In fact, we had developed the app for patient training. That was where it was originally. So we did a study with the Christie in Manchester, and it was in an oncology ward, because that's the type of hospital that the Christie is. And we found that 70% of the training that was happening at the machine was in fact patients. And there was two reasons for that. One is the patients were there and they had nothing else to do. And then the other thing, when we talked to the patients, they said, well, nobody's told me how to prevent infections, and I'm really worried about infections because I'm the one who's going to get them, right? And then we said to the nurses, and the nurses said, well, look, I don't even have time to train my own staff, let alone be training patients as well. And there's hundreds of patients coming through here every day. So there was a need there that wasn't being satisfied. So we said, look, we'll develop the app to train both the patients and their family, because the majority of care was being provided at home, not in the hospital. And while the cross-infection risk wouldn't be as big in the community setting, it was still present. So we developed the app for training patients, and then when we went to Africa and the pandemic struck, the team were not able to travel around Africa to deliver the training. So what they ended up doing was doing Zoom calls with people, and they would introduce themselves and they would demonstrate the technology, but then they would use the app to train people in the remote hospitals. And once they had been introduced to the app and downloaded and coached in that kind of onboarding was provided in the context of a training course, they would use it, because they're obviously concerned about downloading an app that's going to turn on your camera, and it was all too much for them. But once they were introduced to it and they knew it was safe, etc., they were able to use it, and it turned out to be really successful, and it allowed ICANN to actually end up reaching more people than they had beforehand. And it turned out that even though it's a low resource setting, a lot of people had smartphones because it was their primary compute device. It wasn't just a communications device, it was their banking, it was everything. It was on the smartphone. So they didn't have access to PCs. They didn't necessarily have screens in their hospitals, but they were walking around with smartphones in their pockets. So it was a really interesting sort of case study of sort of leapfrogging in technology. Because, obviously nurses,
Here's what I found.
Nurses and doctors tend to be relatively well paid in their communities and tended to have smartphones. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. I think seems like that's all of the questions.
Okay.
Now, would you like to say some concluding notes?
Just let me unmute here, speaking of technology and getting used to it. And I was interested, so before we just conclude, Gerry, then what you were saying about, from an implementation science point of view, both, I guess, in hospitals here, in the sense of if it was a very senior person introducing it, etc., with regard to take up. And I was just wondering, I mean, I don't know if you had feedback from ICANN or others about, was there anything, because this was sort of coming externally, or perhaps seen as an innovative tool or resource that they could have on their smartphone, that there was a relationship to uptake in LMICs as well?
Yeah, so I guess what was interesting is that because the app was on their smartphone, it meant that, so typically ICANN would have gone to a local center, trained up a bunch of people, and then they would have gone to their hospitals and trained up people in their hospitals. And ultimately, the way ICANN assesses that trainee is they go and test the people they have trained. The app allowed that person to go back to their hospital with the device in their hand effectively, and then use that device to do their training. So what was interesting in that environment was that they were now, they had something kind of cool to show their staff. And it allowed them to get greater engagement in their local hospitals. So the technology was quite effective as a kind of guess, a marker of, hey, this is something cool, and a differentiator. That can be a little bit of a double-edged sword. It depends on how people respond to technology. You know, whether some people will go, oh, you know, that's a smartphone, I'm not going to touch that. But generally, there was a certain amount of an age divide. For much older staff, they were suspicious of all things technological, and you know, no, that's not the way. You know, the machine is wrong. Versus the younger people who just treated it as a game. So there was a little bit of an age divide, but certainly making the app and making the technology even more accessible and low cost improved the quality of training throughout the people who are being trained.
Very interesting. Good. I see we're coming up on time. We've just got a couple of minutes left, so maybe in the interest of lunch, etc., we'll stop there. Gerry, thanks very much. That was so interesting. And just, is it okay if we share your slides just with the group? That would be great.
Yeah, no, I'll fire them on to you in an email.
Brilliant. That would be brilliant. And thanks everyone for attending. And just to say, tomorrow, speaking of LMICs and low resource settings, we've Dr. Alice Eclati from MF International University, who will be building on, I think, some of what Gerry was talking there about the role of mobile learning in low resource settings. So that's tomorrow at 12, sort of same time, same channel, I guess. Thanks everyone, and thanks again to Gerry.
Thanks everybody. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.